Good afternoon, my dear friends. Today we are very lucky to have as a next speaker Mr. Bart Lipa, a PhD student in political science and public administration at the Pedagogical University of Krakow. Bart holds a master's degree from the Johannes Goethe Institute of Political Studies at the University of Tartu, where he specialized Baltic Sea region studies, and a bachelor in political science from the University of Pristina, Kosovo. His research interests lie in the fields of political parties, populism, post-conflict peace building, and state building. In particular, he focuses on the development party politics after the declaration of Kosovo independence in 2008, and implications for democratization and state building in Kosovo. He will speak on the topic from anti-system movement to Kosovo ruling party. My dear friend, floor is yours.
Thank you for that very kind introduction. I thank you for enabling me to be here. It is a very thrilling moment to be here. Generally, previously I had an aversion when going to conferences because I was always worried what others will think about my work. And here, because I've been listening to presentations for 4 days, I feel very confident to share my ideas, right? And that's what they are. They are ideas, because different from most of you, my project is still work in progress, right? And to make it as simple as possible, for those that do not have general knowledge on what has happened in Kosovo, I'm going to divide this presentation in 3 parts, meaning I'm going to answer 3 very basic questions: the what, the why, and the how. So the what is Levisia Vetvendosia, which is the movement for self-determination. And the name says a lot, actually. That's how it started. It was founded by a few very young students who were tired and have had enough of corrupt politicians and international auspices ruling in Kosovo. In forming their movement, which was initially a movement, they were characterized by a very strong anti-establishment, antagonist rhetoric, where the interpretation of the historical events concerning Kosovo path to liberation and independence later on have been very contradictory, right? One of these points is the fact that their main goal was joining with Albania, right? Later on, the same movement decided to register as a party in Kosovo and compete for elections. But before they came to that point, their opposition was very hardline. They didn't just ideologically promote problematic ideas about the history of Kosovo and the processes that led to that independence of Kosovo, but they also took measures in their hands, meaning they were very violent in the protests against the UNMIK mostly, which was United Internal Mission in Kosovo. When I say violent, I mean cars were burned, 3 protesters, two protesters from Levisia Vetvendosia were murdered actually by United Nations troops in a improportional use of force. So their way to power has been very, very bloody. And that's where my point actually starts. When you read about Kosovo, and it is almost impossible to read about international relations without having Kosovo being mentioned. It is impossible to read about humanitarian intervention without having the case of Kosovo being mentioned. But very rarely, the actual party politics of Kosovo are analyzed. Very often in foreign studies, Kosovo is purely analyzed from a very far away, detached perspective, meaning it was analyzed from a perspective where the actual actors, local actors in Kosovo, had no say. And that's what I tried to argue with. I tried to say that local actors indeed had a say, and their say was determined in the path that Kosovo had and has today. Now, the other second problematic point that I will make is the fact that I will try to classify the movement for self-determination as an anti-system movement, which is something very novel to do. In those little studies, in those few studies, very minuscule studies that have been done on party politics in Kosovo, you can see that Levizia Vetëndosje is most of the time classified as a left-wing nationalist party or as a populist party, and in one specific case as an anti-establishment party. But from my understanding, that doesn't fully explain the transformation that the party has gone through. Therefore, I bring the system of, I bring the concept of anti-system party, because that's what I believe Vetëndosje was in the beginning. And that's the starting point. In order to measure whether Vetëndosje was an anti-system party and what made Vetëndosje an anti-system party, I'm going to rely on the framework devised by Mathias Ioannelli, which is a very bright young political scientist, and who builds on the concept of Giovanni Sartori. Giovanni Sartori is he coined basically the concept of anti-systemness, right? But in the case of Giovanni Sartori, the problem was that he was mostly referring to fascist and Nazi parties. In order to improve on that, another Giovanni Capoccia, in 2002, builds up again on Sartori's definition and tries to do a reassessment of the concept to make it more applicable in comparative studies. So, different from Sartori's concept, where parties were looked at the historical perspective from in relation to their ideology, fascist and Nazis. In Capoccia's conceptual reassessment, parties are looked based on their ideological profile and their relationless with the other parties in the system in which the party operates. Now, Ioannelli in 2019 does something more. And the reason why he does that is because although Giovanni Capoccia and Giovanni Sartori provide a lot of theoretical background in identifying anti-system parties, they do not explain what actually happens with a party in case they become part of a coalition or part of the government, right? So applying the theoretical framework of Sartori and Capoccia in the case of Vetëndosje would be useless, because they would not explain how and why Vetëndosje became part of the government, the ruling party of the government. Yeah. Now, there are a lot of other theoretical considerations. For instance, you might wonder why I don't use the concept of anti-establishment to deal with Vetëndosje, right? Or why I don't use the term outsider or the term of a challenger party. All of these are terms that have been established to identify and profilize parties that have stand on the furthest corner of the political spectrum. Well, very often these concepts, like I said earlier, were used to profilize Vetëndosje. And the reason why I stick with anti-system, a concept from Ioannelli as the opposite of anti-establishment concept and challenger party and so on, is that the anti-system concept as such is multidimensional. and it relates to the process as such. In the moment I would refer to a party only as anti-establishment or outsider or challenger. For instance, in the outsider party case, I would only refer to the ideological position that the party has within the system. But it does not enable me theoretically to look at how the party has evolved and why the party carries the trait that it carries. In the case of anti-establishment party, that purely relates to the ideological profile of the party, right? And again, it doesn't say anything about the progress or the transformation that the party has gone through. In this sense, the concept of anti-system is absolutely relevant because, like I said, it is multidimensional and refers to the process as such. Now, coming to Zulia Mili's way, means, tools, framework in defining an actual anti-system party, we have to look at two main points. And the first one is the ideological orientation towards the status quo, specifically on metapolitics. So we take Vetvendosia and we look at the political positions that the party has towards the metapolitics, right? And I'll define what metapolitics are in this sense so that you get a better understanding. And the second way to look at it, the second dimension to identifying an anti-system party is by looking at the interactions that the party has with others in the system. Now, what are metapolitics? Metapolitics, according to this theoretical framework definition, are different from meso and micro policies because they refer to the actual political system and economical system and other fundamental changes that the party projects on the society. In the case of Vetvendosia, they wanted to join with Albania, which immediately classifies it as a party that had metapolitical will to change metapolitics in that dimension, for instance. On the second dimension, where you look at the visible interactions with other parties, you see that Vetvendosia was never cooperating with any type of party, right? They were on the far spectrum where everyone that belonged in the system was corrupt, therefore unworthy of any kind of negotiation, cooperation, or anything like that at political or social level. They were seen as enemies, literally. And what happened is that now Vetvendosia is the ruling party in Kosovo, and they are very cooperative. They have drastically shifted their political positions. The same party leader who was throwing cars away in the street and burning them now is the same guy who actually makes photos smiling with the leader of Eulex mission in Kosovo. And yeah, once you have all these indicators there about the transformation that the party has gone, it is worth looking at what does this mean for the party politics as such in Kosovo, and what are the implications for the future of state building in Kosovo. Now, the last point is, because I was often talking about the process that the party goes through as the opposite of just looking at the ideological profile of the party, I employ two other dimensions, which is a fully fledged pro-system party, where the party actually fully integrates in the system by strongly cooperating with every structure of the system as such, and into partially fledged house system party, where the party, although can potentially be part of a coalition or even in the government, they still have a strong tendency to oppose the norms that have been previously set in the system. Yeah, and that's all for me. And now, because this is, like I said, a project in process and I'm still working on it, I would really appreciate any kind of suggestions or recommendations that you could potentially give me in order to make my article, my research as good as possible. Yeah, thank you. much, Mr. Lipa, for your energetic and intelligent presentation. We have 10, 12 minutes, I think, for discussion, so let me open the floor. Thank you.
So just to apologize, a little bit of some of the jargon and some of it you went through very quickly, and I wanted to make sure I understood what was sort of your view versus standard political terms. You said it was meta politics, and you compared those to a couple other terms that I didn't quite hear, so I was trying to take notes on. I apologize if you could just that one kind of go over again.
Thank you for that question. So meta-politics as the opposite of meso and micro policies. The reason why I mention that is because for a party or a movement to qualify as anti-system, it is not enough for them to have a hostile stance towards the other established parties. Or it's not enough to have other policy proposals about things that they believe are, let's say, electoral reform, for instance. That would be a massive policy. So if that Vendorse would be this party who broadly would say, we do not agree with your take on how Kosovo electoral system would look like, that doesn't qualify it as an anti-system party. It has to be more. You have to challenge the whole system as such. You have to challenge the grounds on which the system functions. So meta-politics is used in that sense. When it refers to very important major issues that deal with how the society is, governed.
Mesopolitics, how are you defining that?
So mesopolitics would be when the political party would not challenge the set norms here, but would only provide proposals about less important things, right? So, and then we have micro, which is entirely very minor. Yeah. I hope that answers. If it doesn't, I can try.
It helps me.
Okay. Okay. Super.
Thank you very much. This was very, very interesting. I wanted to ask you, how does this party fit into the definition or the concept of populist party that is often described now in literature as a new kind of party emerging in throughout the Europe?
I mean, if we would employ the concept of populism as a thin-centered ideology in order to popularize a party, then Vendorse would undoubtedly be a populist party. But that's what I'm trying to avoid here. I'm trying to focus only on the ideological profile of the party. I'm trying instead to focus on the transformations that the party has gone through. And that's why I'm trying to employ the framework from Zuyanilis.
I don't feel confident in asking you questions about the particular case study of Kosovo because I don't know the political scene that much. But I like your theoretical approach to classification of anti-systemic parties, and I was wondering if this kind of methodology can be used in order to start the discourse on parties that are subversive of the system and like radically critical of the system, but they're not classifiable as populist. Because like populist literature, in my opinion, now divides parties either in pro-systemic parties or populist. And if you don't agree with like fundamental systemic assumptions of your political life, then you're a populist party. Like can this dichotomy be broken?
So something very important in this context is that when we talk about populism very often, especially recently, in the former waves of populism, we have mostly talked about radical right-wing parties, right? And the difference between radical right-wing parties and the concept of anti-systemness in relation to leftist parties is that an anti-system party is not necessarily an anti-democratic party. This is very important. In the case of radical right-wing populist parties, very often they challenge the democracy as such, right? They challenge the norms that have established by hundreds of years of liberal democracy. Whereas, and this is something that is so often emphasized by Zulianelli in his theoretical framework, that although Vedvendosia would be, let's say, in the ideal scenario, classified as an anti-system party, that doesn't in any way mean that it would be anti-democratic, right? Because if you look at the setting in which the party is developed, it is precisely to go against the autocratic international missions in Kosovo. But the means that they have used in order to get to power and the instruments utilized to achieve what they wanted politically are therefore radical, but not the goal as such. Their goal was, not to overthrow the system. Does that answer a bit? Yeah. Any other question?
If I may, I have a question, and there's an interesting point, and just a bit of clarification so that you know where I come from. I've been in politics for 20 years, so my whole adult life, and there's this new phenomenon in Croatia. New, not that much, 5 years maybe. Political parties that pride themselves on the fact that they do not want to have anything to do with anyone that has ever had anything to do with politics or public leadership of any kind. And at first that was not a very successful narrative, but in the meantime we've had some serious success by people like that. The mayors of our two largest towns are people who have that narrative, and but sometimes it seems to me that, but coming from a position, that's why I informed you about that, coming from a position of an old school politician, or almost an ancien regime politician from an old political party, it seems to me like you're choosing someone to operate on your appendix who prides themselves on never having operated in their entire life. And it seems to me that this kind of political narrative is getting more and more ground. And the party you're talking about seems to be one of those as well. So, generally, what do you think about this sort of narrative, and why is it so successful, or why is it getting more and more successful? And is it something that will, in terms of this conference, is this revulsion and this rejection of traditional political parties and traditional political party systems something that will lead us in the future to peace building and keeping of peace, having in mind historical situations where this happened that usually did not end very well, considering that political parties, with all their faults, with all their problems, with all their inefficiencies, are still the backbone of a democratic, pluralistic state. Thanks.
Thank you for that. That brings me. I really appreciate that, because it brings attention to something very relevant in the case of Vedvendosia. And I will talk about Vedvendosia because that's what I know of. I do not. In the case of Vedvendosia, the actual antagonistic profile towards the other parties and international missions as such Therefore, the lack of willingness to cooperate in any kind of way with anyone from the political system was based in historical processes that were quite harmful for the Kosovan society. For instance, in fact, the Dosa was founded in 2005 as a movement, but in 2004, after 5 years of rule by United Nations mission in Kosovo, the whole structures collapsed, and there was an unrest by Kosovo people, which showed the fragility that the mission had, and the approach, the very wrong technocratic top-down approach that they had. So in that case, the frustration that the Vendosia had towards the mission as such, and towards the other political actors that were in some kind of way part of those interactions was, I believe it was honest. They really genuinely meant it. They were not manipulative in the sense of using the political context to achieve political goals. The second factor that confirms this is the fact that Vendosia was not registered as a party until many years after. They were a civic movement who didn't even consider the idea of participating in the election. So in that sense, there is something unique about Vendosia, because very often when you look at the case of let's say radical right-wing populist parties in Europe, like let's say ECRE in Estonia, for instance, or even AfD in Germany, there are so many trade-offs, there are so many strategies that they purposefully employ when they are about to compete in the election. And before Vendosia got registered, they never cared about that. Violence was the only way, and they believed that that will change the status quo of Kosovo. And yeah, I hope that puts some light on your question.
I have a question now that you were referring also to the AfD, and I was thinking also in the similar kind of parties that we have in Spain and also in France, and also the different strategies that the rest of the political parties in those countries are using versus these kind of parties like the AfD or like Vox in Spain. Yeah? So I just would like to know your opinion in which do you think it's the best strategy to deal with them? Because, for instance, in Spain, Vox, which is more or less like the AfD, they are going into coalitions, normal coalitions in places, and they are having share of power in municipalities and the parliament and so on and so forth. While in Germany, for instance, it is almost forbidden for the countries, and people had to resign in certain parties because they wanted or they tried to go into an agreement with these parties in a coalition. And I just wanted to know, like, what do you think is the best strategy, taking into account the thing of the peace and thinking, in the future, having the experience that we have in the past, what happens with this kind, of parties? What do you think it's the best strategy to deal with them? Is to include them in the system, to try to attract them in the system, going into the risk that, maybe it turns out a fraud, I'm not a prince, or we just, try to isolate them and, marginalize them, with the risk as well that if you are marginalizing a party and the people that are supporting this party, then you're promoting what we call like the radical losers, which is again a phenomenon in the society which is very dangerous, and we are seeing it everywhere.
Thank you for that question as well. There is a very well-made theoretical framework by Ackerman and others, I believe in 2016, where they look at the mainstreaming of the parties in the European Union. And they have 4 different dimensions to measure that, right? And very often, almost in 90% of the cases, the parties that are studied have not mainstreamed, actually. They have further radicalized. And that comes down to the, that is explained by the statements that you made, actually. The parties were very often isolated by the mainstream spectrum of the parties. And although often they became more radical, they moved towards the margins of the political spectrum of the parties, they often got more support, and that was the case of the AfD, for instance, and how the support for the AfD increased. And when actually studies look at why the AfD was supported so much and how could that have been prevented, there is a major flaw in the approach that Merkel's government had towards the group of citizens that were not pleased with the way she was dealing with migration. So there was this gap left where a large population of the people felt misrepresented or not represented at all, and the AfD took advantage of that. Therefore, a very simple way of preventing that is by actually taking into account the interests of citizens regardless of how radical they might seem like. That way, because after all, that is the notion of democracy in its purest form, right? They are all citizens of the country, they all have all the right to be represented, and their voice should be heard as well. And if that voice is not heard, then means of radicalization are, very occurring, so to say. Yeah. Thank you.
I will not thank you because I really want to ask you something in addition. First, when you are talking about Revizia Veteran Dossier, that's movement. And you compare this movement with some parties. And that's really not easy to compare it. Because Alternative for Deutschland, that's the party with a couple of topics, Euro and then anti-migration, or German mark and anti-migration, and the movement is probably have a lot of topics inside and somehow include a lot of wishes for better society. Maybe some of those wishes, maybe of those ideas are in correlation, maybe are not, but that is the movement, it's different. So my first question is actually how the people inside will ideologically identify themselves, how other parties, members, will identify that dossier, how European and Western will identify themselves. And the additional question is actually, you spoke again about AfD, and AfD is one very unique party in Germany, and probably one of the parties that is most in political analysis last couple of years, or maybe now decades already. And that means actually we know a lot of things of those parties. And one of those is, for example, it is very important who is behind this party. It is not, it is not only the wish of people. They are not represented, and then they support one idea. Come on, the thing is not so easy. It is geopolitical situation, and we know who paid those parties in the Europe. And that's something what you can find easily in a lot of scientific articles. I don't speak about the news media articles. I'm talking about scientific articles. So my question is actually, can you see something like that connected to Revizia Veteran Dossier as well? Is someone behind them? Some money, big money? From where? Because this is probably the most interesting. Then we can see, okay, that's the direction they want to rule Kosovo in this direction or another direction. Thank you.
Thank you for those remarks and your question. So first I'm going to start by clarifying once again that although Levicia with Vendosa was initially identified as movement, later on they actually registered to participate in the election. And regardless of how they identify themselves, in the moment you become part of the election, you are not a movement anymore. You're a party, you're a political party, you're competing for power. And you're using all the instruments to do that. Florian Hartleb, in a 2015 article where he looks at anti-establishment parties, I think it is called Anti-Establishment Parties Here to Stay, he lists 12 different criteria on how an anti-establishment, he refers to anti-establishment parties all the time. And one of the criteria that is found there, one of the key criteria is that anti-establishment parties love referring themselves to as movements. Right? Because that is more related to the people as such, to the will of the people, the bottom-up approach. So, I mean, in literature this has been identified and clarified. In the case of Vendosia, is there money behind? I don't think so. I think there are so many problems with the way they are currently ruling Kosovo. There are so many issues to be addressed. But I think that the basis, the foundation of the movement and the party as such was quite idealist. It was a product of a very corrupt political elite in Kosovo, and Vendosia was the main force that aimed to challenge that. And they did it, because they became in a very unique manner. It is very difficult to find such an example in Europe, actually, where a party within 2 electoral cycles get 47% of the electoral vote. And that only shows how disappointed the Kosovo electorate was with the previous ruling elite without any exception. And whether they will get this result in the upcoming election, well, I think that is something we have to see, to wait and see. Oh, thank you, yeah.
Only shortly, when we are talking about movements, for example, HDZ in Croatia started as a movement with one goal, independent Croatia, but very different groups were inside. How to reach that? Very, very, very different groups. So, and they won elections as a party, but actually that was the movement. And long period almost during the 90s, that was actually movement. It was political party, but in reality that was movement. So, one is law definition. The law definition is political party. A political definition of one political scientist can be different. It is not the same thing. Yeah.
What you just said actually makes a very good point that I forgot to mention, because that is often the purpose of movements. They are short-term entities that actually have a goal or two. They do not stay permanently on the scene. And regardless of what that structure says, if they are there to compete for power and they have projects on how to make the place better, then yeah, that absolutely is an indicator of the political party status. Yeah, thank you for that as well.
Dear Bart, thank you. As you see, actually, discussion can continue again and again and again, okay, but we will have to stop. Thank you once again on great lecture. Thank you for this great discussion. I'm almost sure this discussion will continue in the garden. And thank you once again. And now we have another speaker, Nuria Mazdeu Tamiyas. She studied law at the University de Barcelona and economics at the University Oberta de Catalunya. PhD on trade law in the Freie Universität of Berlin. Wordt ze zeggen zu Berlin, aber okay. Aber dann After 15 years working in corporate private sector in Europe and Asia, moved to peace, conflict and development studies with a postgraduate in the Escola de Cultura de Pau, School for Cultural Peace in the University Autónoma de Barcelona. And after in 2017, she studied peace studies at the Chulalongkorn University in Bangkok. Since 2015, she is working as the regional manager for the Middle East in a French NGO attached to the French Cooperation Agency. She published different articles in academic and international journals. She will talk today on a critical approach to the international development today, the role of NGO and cooperation agencies in introducing a peace and conducive economic development framework.
Yeah.
My dear Maria, floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you very much for allowing me to join the conference and also to present or to deal with this kind of topic, which is a bit far from, well, I'm going to say a bit far, but it's a bit different than academia, so I'm just, I am rather a practitioner, so I consider myself a practitioner. I came here as a practitioner. This is why everything what I'm going to explain right now is very much focused on the operational side and the dealing with peace on the field. So I am not going to go to the definition of positive peace, which is the one that we use also within our interventions and in general in the NGO world, because Patricia explained it very well. I just want to give this very small definition that this is a set of attitudes, institutions, and structures that create, promote, and sustain peaceful societies. I like this definition very much. This is from Jean-Paul Laderac, who I had the pleasure to work for a while. And yeah, I mean, this is actually the framework that we are working with. Because positive peace at the end is what can really transform, promote, and produce healthy societies. And at the end, this is what we want, to have healthy societies. These are the 8 pillars. This is the source of, this is the IEP. And this is, I'm not going to go into this because this is what Patricia also explained. Mostly when we are dealing with projects, we are focusing in these four sectors: justice, security, change welfare.
I think that the paper is there.
Hello? No, it works again. I think it's like.
Are you sure?
Okay, so the 8 pillars, we mix them, some like a cocktail. We make 4 different cocktails, and we have the justice, security, good governance, and sustainable inclusive economic development. And these are mostly the 4 areas in which we are working on in our projects. But the most important thing is that at the end, it doesn't matter which kind of intervention you plan, it doesn't matter which kind of project you want to do, if it doesn't conduce to decent livelihoods, you're not implementing a good agenda, you're not implementing a good project on development. So it doesn't matter in which of both you're working. At the end, it has to be the result that you are producing decent livelihoods for the people that you are targeting and are living in the countries that you're working on. Why are decent livelihoods so important? Well, this is the origin, the very, very start of the Arab Spring in Tunisia. And the Arab Spring in Tunisia was sparked by a person that had no hope, had no future, considered that there was no space for him in society. He put himself on fire. This was a street vendor, Mohammed Bouazizi, and this is what started in Tunisia, and it was then widespread to the whole region. And actually, it brought like to zero years and years of cooperation and thousands of euros and millions and billions of euros in cooperation that was invested in the region, just in one moment. So this is why, if we are not able to improve on the field the conditions of the people, then it doesn't matter what we do, because it will not have, it can be destroyed in a second. I'm going to go very fast about this. This is just to give you an overview about the sort of maze that we have to deal when we are working on development. So basically, there are three levels of agendas. There is the agenda of the global agendas, which actually is not the global, it's the globalized agendas. For instance, the World Bank. For instance, the UN, they have this kind of globalized agendas. Then we have the bilateral cooperations. There are countries that are signing bilateral treaties with other countries, or the EU, as such, is also signing a bilateral contract, a bilateral agreement with Egypt, with Tunisia, with whoever. And at the bottom, we have the development. The development agenda is much more close to the people, close to the needs of the population, while the other two, they are more working on macroeconomic KPIs and on other kind of topics. For instance, it's very difficult that we, in the development level, were implementing a project on water, really like a huge project, because this is something that belongs to the other two levels. The three levels are informed by the SDGs. The recipients I have explained more or less. I mean, the NGOs, normally they only get money on the development level, while the states and the international institutions, they get it on the other two. And in terms of the tools that they use, normally the NGOs get grants, and for the other two levels, there is a very small grant, but normally they are cooperation funds and loans, which is another thing that is also included here. So these institutions, or in these two other levels, loans are provided to some states so that they can implement part of the activities that are in the contracts. So I'm just going very fast through the main challenges that we have. Basically, it's this kind of multiplicity of agendas. So when you want to implement a project, then you have to look which donor is really interested in what you want to do. And then the agenda will never fit exactly what you want to do. Also, the agendas are overlapping, sometimes are even conflicting, and sometimes the agendas of the same donor in the same country are conflicting. So an NGO might be, for instance, having two different projects with two different donors for the same different target that are not exactly coherent. So this is again a problem. Another problem is the misalignment between the political will and the political agenda and the cooperation agenda of the countries. And this is a very sensitive issue in some places, for instance in Palestine. The cooperation or the development agendas go one way, but then the political agenda is not so willing to support the cooperation agenda, which makes things actually less effective. We are still looking at the countries in the Middle East in a very orientalistic way, so we are still not taking into consideration all the cultural differences that we have, and this is something that is happening now, today, so it's not over yet. And then we have the trends, which means that, for instance, now the trend is social entrepreneurship, which means that if you want to implement a project on social entrepreneurship, you will have 55 donors that will be happy to give you money for. But if you want to implement a project on youth or in disabilities, then you will have no one, because the trend right now is this one. So you are more or less trying to balance the money that you have with the donors, and at the end you are not able to invest for a lot of time on a certain target, because you never know how the next agenda will look like, which is the focus in the next envelope for whatever donor. And for me, another point that is also very important is atomization. We are very much concentrated in very small projects, and we lose the global view of the country that we're working with, of the target that we're working with, so that actually we don't even know which other organizations are working on the same topic than we are, and this is not even promoted by the donors. Synergies or cooperations, or this is something that it seems like if donors are really more interested in keeping us like in our very small Bantustans working, without knowing what the rest are doing. So, and this is also a loss of efficiency. And last but not least, for me, the perceived impact is very important, because you can send a lot of, you can start 100 projects with lots of millions of euros, but if the people do not have the feeling that this money is really helping them to improve their life, then it's, it's like the loss of the image of the EU in certain areas, and in the Middle East, this is something is very, very common, that when you talk about the EU, so normally people are not very positive, or they think that that the money stays in the government, or that they are not really very interested in the Egyptians. They are only interested in the business with the Egyptian government. So this is again something that is very important, and this is a challenge that we have in our interventions. So with this framework, a group of NGOs in Egypt, we have started something different. So we have been working for the last 6 months on trying to swim against the current a little bit, or at least to try it. Egypt is a big country. There's a lot of funding. There are a lot of donors, a lot of actors working there, and the chaos is quite obvious. Better, or it's more evident than in other parts of the Middle East, at least on this level. And what we have decided is just to go for certain actions. Yeah, so really, at least to try. The first one is to educate the donor. So instead of taking what the donor is taking, is just giving feedback to the donor beyond what they want us to give, because normally the donor is interested only in the reporting, is interested in the monitoring, but not in the evaluation, not in the long-term impact of the projects that could actually give us hints and information to take decisions to improve the program. So this is something that we cannot do because the project cycle is too short. So we are really committed on keeping this kind of evaluation more than monitoring, so that we are able to give back to the donors a kind of reporting that this is not what they are actually expecting, or this is not what they are really interested in, but they will have it anyway. More evaluation, than monitoring. Listening instead of studying. There are countries like Palestine that they have been, I think it's the country that it has been more studied in the last 40 years. It's really impossible to read all the information that you have in terms of studies that they are available on any single thing. But at the end, nothing moves, nothing improves. So for me, it's more a question of listening and recognizing the real needs instead of launching immediately a study. Let's get a consultant. Let's get someone, and then because this is a lot of money that at the end it is just nice to have. We have done it. It's it's in the internet. You read it, but you cannot take any kind of learnings and any kind of practical information out of it. Keeping the global picture. Very important as well that positive P's and then SDGs, they have to be really a goal, because right now it's just something programmatic that you have in the call for proposals. So you do this action or this activity, this leans in the SDG, blah, blah, blah. But actually, when you are going to evaluate the activity, there is no mention, there is no relationship with any SDGs. So actually, it's just a framework, which is nice, but we are not measuring the SDGs for any of the activities that we're implementing right now in development. And also I think it's quite important to start increasing the cooperation with the academia. This is something we're doing with the American University in Cairo in order to develop some kind of tools. And this is something that we are considering actually to continue growing, at least in this case. And last but not least, I would like to explain to you the case study that we're going to take to start with this kind of reporting back to the donor, which is the effects of financial inclusion agenda. So Egypt, just to give you an idea, 34% of the population is living under poverty line, 31% are illiterate, and I mean people in Cairo that cannot write and read, which is a lot. 63% of the population are working in an informal sector, and I didn't write it here, but 60% of the population don't have a bank account, so they are unbanked. So within this financial inclusion project, the idea within the EU envelopes of the last one was to turn financial services into cashless. Include the majority of the society into the banking system, And by September 1st, so in a few months or a few days, few weeks, taxes will only be able to be paid with a credit card and online. So even in a country in Europe, this would be very challenging. So in a country like Egypt, this is not challenging, it is just impossible. But because there will be an enforcement system, the police will go shop by shop to check. What we are really seeing for the contact we have with beneficiaries is that around 8% of the businesses will close, which is a lot. And I'm talking not about the informal, about the formal, because they will not be able to cope with this, which means that the informal sector will grow, and this will have a huge impact on the economy and on the labor market. Especially affected will be the vulnerable sectors, of course. It will be an impact on the education, because everything that impacts the women and the economic capacity of women impacts education, because they are the ones that are really very much interested in providing their children with a very good education, and they are really going the extra mile to bring their children to any kind of education or school where they have to pay, but that they are having, because this is for them still the promise of a better future. It goes through education still. And the last, but actually for me one of the most important ones, is the increase of the family debt. That right now it doesn't exist. So there is no debt in Egypt. Families, they have no debt. It's very, very, very low. The loan system in the private loan system in Egypt is almost non-existent. But if you have a credit card, and if you have to start paying and using the credit card without having any kind of education on that, if you are additionally illiterate, what we will see here is an increase, the creation and an increase of the family debt that actually in the middle term will be devastating for the families. And this, of course, in a context in which we are going to go through the second devaluation of the Egyptian pound versus the euro and the dollar, additional 20%, and where we have an inflation of 18%. So this is actually part of the agenda of, this is only an action, but this is only an activity of within this development. Actually, this is for the cooperation agenda, but the development agenda is included because as NGOs, the donors wants to force us to convince the beneficiaries to take a credit card, so we are in a way involved in all this kind of loop. No? So the idea is to start tracking all this, to monitor, to evaluate, of course, and by the end of next year to prepare a report that we can submit to the EU, just to have like real impact on actions and funded programs, by the EU. So thank you very much. This was everything. Thank you so much.
So thank you so much for this great presentation.
Thank you for sharing all of that. I wonder if you could share with us a positive story that keeps you going, a story of the youth you've worked with, that you can come back when you see all of those challenges, and knowing you're going to face it, no matter what region you go into, what's a story that you carry with you that we can go through?
I can't hear you well, sorry.
That's better. So, as you review all those challenges, I was wondering if you could share with us a story about one of the youth you've worked with that keeps you going, because you know, as you go into new areas, all the obstacles you're going to face. And so what's something that you've experienced that keeps you hopeful?
Well, I mean, basically, other people that work in development, we don't do it for the money. We do it in a way, I don't know, because we believe that what we do is Is it still relevant? And because we try to do our best, we try to fill the gaps, and we try to solve this kind of myopia, that other institutions are having. And because at the end, there are many things that if we don't do it, when you are in those countries, is that the state is not doing anything. So if you're not doing this, even though it's not perfect, it is something that you're contributing to. But in a way, I still think that that we can do better, and that in the same way that I take very seriously the fact that I am working with public money, and this is money from you, from your taxes. This is EU money, and I am very careful when I'm using it. I also expect that the EU is careful. Not only in confiscating, not confiscating, but not only in checking if we have all the invoices, and this is perfect. I mean, this is something we can provide. But the question is, how are we using this money, and for which goal? And what we cannot do is just to implement a project, like thinking 5 minutes, 10 minutes, and we're going to do this without really having the long-term projection of how things will be. And sometimes there is in the EU, especially in the AFD, there is different, but there's a lot of copy-pasting. And it's not the same implementing a project in Tunisia than implementing a project. I deal with 4 or 5 different countries. And even if it's the same project, it's not the same Lebanon, especially in the Middle East. It's not the same Lebanon, it's not, of course, the same Syria. It's not the same Palestine, and it's not the same Egypt. I'm not only talking about the size of the country and the regime, and if it's more or less stable. It's just not, it's not the same because the history of the countries are not the same. For instance, in Egypt, there is no really industry. There is very, very few industry. So if we are producing lots of vocational trained students, if there is no industry that to involve them after, actually, we're not doing anything. We're educating youth. For what? It's great. But the question is that we have to try to consider the whole process, and not only, these small things. Okay, vocational training, that's great, but let's also try to support MSEs, for instance. Or this, for me, it's still the agendas are still not very coherent, and I'm not sure if there is a solution. But what we know is that top-down doesn't work. So we're going to try to go a little bit more bottom-up and try to throw the ball up and see if something happens. So.
What's one story of one unit you work with?
Yeah, so actually, one youth, we work with, there is one woman, we work, she was divorced, or she got divorced actually, like 2 days after getting married. And she had given up everything, studying and so on, so she didn't have any kind of education. She was, in a way, pregnant. So it was a very, the family didn't want her anymore. So it was actually quite interesting, or actually quite satisfying to see the evolution in terms of we help her to get a vocational training. Actually, in something which is a bit strange for women in the area, which is electricity. She wanted to study electricity maintenance, and we have a school for that. And she will graduate, actually now in September we will have the ceremony. Her daughter is actually 3.5, and she has already a job. So before the graduation, because we are providing internship for the students, she will be taking over one of the companies where she did the internship. So these kind of stories are the ones that keep us going. Sorry.
And thank you for your presentation. It really resonates with also a lot of frustrations I had when I was working with NGOs. And I completely agree with you, but I want to go maybe even further in the provocation that you are throwing. And I think that practitioners should abandon the concept of positive peace. It doesn't make a lot of sense. It's an abstract idea that gets filled from time to time with whatever the liberal community thinks that it's positive to promote. And also it kind of gives a misconception on the difficulties of social change, because sometimes people, they have to stand up for some things, but standing up for social change is not always conducive to stability. It can create like unrest into societies, and I think it misrepresents what are many times the struggles of people living in harsh communities, and that's my response to your provocation.
I understand your point. I see where you come from, but for me, positive peace is not a status quo. It's not a definition. It's a framework, and actually, it's like an aspiration. If you want, it's an utopia, and as utopia, I think it's as revolutionary as you want it to be. If you want to have like a framework where things are stable because you think your society is perfect, okay, then of course, positive peace is a concept that you can. Define which structures this is. We don't say how healthy societies can be. This is why, for me, the concept is very much adaptable to any kind of, even from the topological point of view, it's very much adaptable to any kind of culture or society that you can meet, because you're not imposing an agenda. Sometimes healthy relationships in certain societies for us are not healthy at all. But if it's like the Germans said, when shame macht, I mean, if you like it, it's your culture, it's your way of working. So this is why, for me, this concept is sort of I would say revolutionary if you want, or stable is if you don't want. Of course, you have to be careful that people don't think that positive peace is like an agenda, and this is why I say that it is something that we also have to try to explain in the right way. And this is, I think, what we're trying to do as well. So that we are not again into the peace thing where we get rolling eyes when people, peace. Yeah, again, yes, okay. So this is, but maybe the concept of peace in general, and is it peace to say it now, but maybe the concept of peace is a bit used and abused. So this is maybe the problem is the word.
Thank you. I have a great talk. And one question, just a continuation of this question. So in global healthcare, we often put some targets, for example, 90% lower incidence or prevalence of disease by 2030, and it's seldom achieved, very rarely achieved. And when you ask them why is that the case, then the answer is you have to put overly optimistic goals in order to achieve it. Do you think something similar is in regards to positive peace? How is your view on that?
Well, I mean, one thing is to be optimistic, and the other thing is to set goals that you will never reach. I mean, when we set goals in general, we try to. I mean, we always, it's like very old-fashioned, but this is a smart thing, like they have to be measurable and they have to be attainable. Which means that if you're setting goals, the question is, I would say we have to put realistic goals, but they have to be further unattainable. And positive peace, as I said, is like kind of utopia, no? And this is the magic of it, because it's something that you will never catch in your hand, because there is always something that you can do to improve that. And this is a concept that it is not only for the Middle East, or it's for us. We have to take also this concept and see, do we have positive peace in Europe? Do we have positive peace, for instance, during the crisis, during the economic crisis? There was no positive peace. No way. because people were forced, to, the situation there was no positive peace anywhere. So for me, this is why it is not something, it's not only a concept we have to look at the Middle East or at Africa or South America or whoever, it's something that we can measure us against. And as a kind of utopia, for me, it's, I don't know, it's something where you can always improve something without making it out of an obsession that you are. But I think it's encouraging, at least it's for me, it's not, it's not a law.
Yeah, Nuria, I think we can continue, of course, this interesting discussion in the garden or somewhere else. So, thank you once again for a very inspiring speech. Thank you for this great discussion. And now we will finish with this lecture. We will finish today participation in this conference. And now I will